Art of Glenn Gould, Take 20. On this, the penultimate program of this 21-week series, it was to be 22, but the World Series changed all that. Mr. Gould joins Ken Haslam for a discussion of critics and criticism, a subject for which, in Mr. Gould's career at least, the present music, Beethoven's Sonata Opus 109, is perhaps not altogether inappropriate.
Well, Mr. Gould, I gather from that sly inference of Maggie Morris's at the top of the show that the Beethoven Opus 109, of which we're just hearing the first movement, provided something of a watershed for your relations with the critical profession.
Yes, it did, sir.
When was it released?
In 1956, I believe.
And I gather it was greeted with something close to universal condemnation from the press, is that correct?
With one or two, as I would like to think, notable exceptions, yes.
And this has been a bone of contention ever since, is that it?
Well, no, I think that's overstating the case, Ken.
Yeah, but I seem to recall reading somewhere, Glenn, that in your concert-giving days, you managed to schedule Opus 109 on every second program at least.
Well, I think every third might be more accurate, Ken.
I see. In other words, we're dealing with a compulsive reiteration complex here. Very interesting.
I wouldn't go that far, actually.
Oh, but after all, Glenn, the record does predate stereo by at least a year. If, as you say, you released it in 1956, and I should think there have been several opportunities to remake it in the intervening years.
Well, there have been one or two offers of that kind, yes.
And yet you have stubbornly refused to re-record this sonata. The better to keep alive the occasion for that deep-seated grudge against the critical fraternity that you have nurtured for so long?
I think that's a very considerable exaggeration, sir, if you don't mind my saying so. I've had many other unfavorable reviews as well, many just as bad as this one.
Please, allow me to treat this case in my own way. One can never overestimate the long-term effects of a traumatic review experience. Have you tried any other form of therapy prior to today's consultation?
Yes, I wrote a short story for radio about 4 years ago.
Which has as its subject the critical profession, is that it?
Yes, that's correct.
Uh-huh. And did you name names, confront your adversaries directly within it?
No, I treated the various critics who participated in the story pseudonymously. As a matter of fact, I had originally intended to write it under a pen name as well.
Uh-huh. A very typical case of reality withdrawal, complicated by identity confusion, no doubt. Well, Mr. Gould, this is a bit more serious than I'd imagined. Perhaps we should listen to this pseudonymous effort of yours in the hope that it might throw some light on the subject.
The announcement that the North American Music Critics Alliance would hold its annual conference seminar in Port Chilkoot, Alaska, was the occasion for factional dissent within the ranks of that august body, casual surprise in the entertainment sections of the New York dailies, and utter disbelief in the 49th State's Fourth Estate.
Eilers pick Panhandle Port
Was Variety's headline, but the Showbiz Weekly was hard-pressed to develop the item since
No info on Chilkoot draw power or seat cap available since '98.
no such reticence prevailed in Alaska, however, where the mainland dailies played the story front page, and the Anchorage Whaler and Spooner got off a biting editorial under the title What Price Gratitude, denouncing the Port Chilkoot Chamber of Commerce.
In our opinion, no useful, not to say honorable, purpose can be served by the short-sighted opportunism of our fellow citizens of the Inside Passageway in their ill-concealed attempt to siphon off the tourist flow upon which the economic growth of our great state depends. We would remind them that the SS Skagway Princess, from which these learned gentlemen will disembark, is a vessel subsidized by all the citizens of our state, and an important lifeline for the ocean-side communities therein. It is, moreover, patently foolish for a community of 400 souls to covet and promote a convention trade, for which they have neither the appropriate facilities nor, we respectfully submit, the savoir-faire. We would ask that His Honor Mayor Sven Wennergren soberly and earnestly reconsider his position in this matter, and in so doing, reflect for a moment upon the fate of Brighton, or Ostend, or Scheveningen, where the intellectual luster and aesthetic glories of London, Brussels, or Amsterdam to tarnish and decline.
Curiously enough, the good citizens of Port Chilcoot were at this time entirely unaware of the furor in which their community had become entangled, and were to remain so until the sunrise edition of the Whaler and Spooner arrived aboard the Skagway Princess at dusk the following day. Mayor Venner Gren, glancing over the editorial page on his way to the comics, elected to bypass what-price gratitude, assuming it to be yet another reappraisal of the Franco-American alliance, but was aroused from his contemplation of Brenda Star-Girl reporter by an urgent call from Magdalena Murphy, copy editor and fine arts critic of the Port Chilcoot Packet. When his honor's blood pressure had crested, he and Magdalena descended upon Harry Southam, owner and prop of Southam's Sanitary Snacks, and participant, as Magdalena had discovered at the Western Union office, in an unusually brisk telegraphic exchange in recent days. Sure enough, Harry Southam was able to produce, from over the Kool-Aid counter, a complete file of his negotiations with one Lars Trollenstern, chairman of the Critics Alliance Accommodations Committee, and in his own right, music critic of the New York Witness Centurion. The exchange had begun when Mr. Trollenstern, settling upon Port Chilcoot for reasons which were far from clear to Harry, inquired about the possibility of assembly space and lodgings, 12 singles, 4 doubles, 6 cots. Harry, after consultation with his wife, Christabel, in which they agreed that fate was indeed knocking at the door, and that this was perhaps the year for them to knock out the kitchen wall and add the east wing they'd talked of so often. Bayside Exposure, their ad in the Alaska Auto Advertiser could read next year, replied in the affirmative and assured Mr. Trollenstern that meeting facilities were readily at hand. He was sure he could swing it with the loyal Coyote Brotherhood for use of the lodge hall. A subsequent wire from New York inquired whether artist rates were available for the group, to which Christabel and Harry readily assented, since although no such precedent existed in the annals of Port Chilcoot tourism, they felt it would be best to give the critics the benefit of the doubt rather than risk losing the trade. Yet another wire was forthcoming, this time from Septile PQ, where Keddy McQuaig, music critic of L'Estrelita de Septile, inquired as to whether the premises were licensed. Harry, by this time possessed of a cavalier telegraphic style, responded,
Plenty booze available. Stop. Can also arrange guest membership after hours club called Oiler's Roost. Regards.
Back in New York, the conference plans were gathering something less than unanimous approval from within the alliance. Lars Trollenstern, as accommodations chairman, a compensatory post traditionally awarded the preceding year's runner-up for the presidency, used his considerable influence to bring off the Port Chilcoot decision, since as nominal leader of the pro-composing faction within the alliance, he was determined to seek out a place where the discussion of ideas would take precedence over their representation in performance. This, of course, was wholly antagonistic to the pro-performing faction headed by his arch-rival Homer Sibelius, the chief critic of the New York Square. And as the Port Chilcoot decision drew nearer, both of them courted the votes of such middle-of-the-roaders as Waldorf Major, critic of the influential weekly Old Gothamer, and H.B. Hagel of the Housatonic Review. A crisis loomed when the entire English-Canadian delegation withdrew, claiming justifiably that Whitehorse, Yukon Territories, a town of far greater historical interest, was the logical site for the convention. Only Keddy McQuaig of L'Estrelita de Septile decided not to boycott, since he felt that his sole presence, in addition to providing eloquent testimony upon that brittle biracial détente of modern Canada, would enable him to get in some research for his forthcoming Skura book, The Klondike, Its Women and Saloons. The decision, however, rested with Lars Trollenstern, and he held fast to Port Chilcoot, even when, a fortnight before the convention, Homer Sibelius threw a public tantrum, courtesy of his Sunday column in the Square, in which, for this occasion only, he abandoned his to-be-continued reminiscence of those glorious days when giants walked the stages of the world, and marshaled his celebrated literary style, forever made secure and immune to change during his interminable apprenticeship on the sports desk, in a public denunciation of Lars Trollenstern.
A strong criticism provides a strong musical environment. Unsportsmanlike though it may be, I am at last about to take off the kid gloves and to cease pulling my punches with my opponent, Lars Trollenstern. It is time my readers knew that this man, this critic, has tried to KO a strong criticism in this country.
And on he went, solidly building his attack. and for 2 or 3 days thereafter its substance was much debated in the Russian tea room. Upon their arrival in the lovely harbor which serves the twin towns of Port Chilkoot Haines, or Haines Port Chilkoot as they are known on the other side of the bay, the gentlemen of the press were greeted dockside by the members of the Chilkoot Continuation School Choir and Silver Band, and favored with the inaugural rendition of a civic anthem specially composed by 14-year-old Graham W. Clarkson, Jr., whose father, Graham W. Clarkson, Sr., is vocational guidance instructor and vice principal at Chilkoot CS, sung to a tune which, with its modulatory sobriety, puts one in mind of the late Dr. Stanford's chorales. It had, as Homer Sibelius was later to jot down while trying to fit it into the freelance holiday travel piece he was determined to get out of the trip,
The hard, clear truth of Northern Light. Make that the hard, clear light of Northern truth. Or perhaps the clear, hard...
Well, these things take time, you know. Though its public premiere was reserved for the critics' disembarkation, it had been tried out by Magdalena Murphy at the preceding week's executive meeting of the Chilkoot Press Club.
From Chilkoot's icy glacier, or Chilkoot's lowering fjord, a crack was heard, a rumble caught, a gathering roar, full danger fraught, and down the slope it poured. From Chilkoot's icy glacier, or Chilkoot's new-made plains, a foot was seen, and then an arm. Thank God our town is safe from harm. Tonight it buried Haines.
Upon the conclusion of the anthem, to which, at the artful suggestion of Magdalena Murphy, the choir appended the Dresden Amen, the critics were greeted unofficially by Magdalena and Harry Southam, and presented by Harry with mimeographed copies of their convention schedule, thoughtfully enclosed within a sample menu of Southam's sanitary snacks, which bore on the outside the legend,
Lord, give us the grace to accept those things we cannot reject, and to reject those things we cannot accept.
at once a credo peculiarly befitting the critical profession, and, as they were shortly to discover, singularly pertinent to Christabel Southam's cuisine.
Convention schedule. First day, Saturday.
1 p.m.,
Arrival via SS Skagway Princess.
2:30 p.m.,
Official greetings.
His Honor Mayor Sven Wennergren, or Deputy. 8 p.m.,
Opening forum subject. The changing world of the reviewer.
by Homer Sibelius.
Second day, Sunday.
8:45 a.m.,
The Quaver in Krennic. From a paper in progress.
Lars Trollenstern. 10:30 a.m.,
Sightseeing tour, including town docks, sewage disposal plant, pipeline maintenance workshop.
hostess Magdalena Murphy. 2 p.m.,
Leitmotif in Carlisle Floyd.
by Waldorf Major. 3:30 p.m.,
Stravinsky as dancer.
by H.B. Hagel. 5 p.m.,
Speculations on the chemical composition of Tristan's love potion.
by Kerry McQuaig. 8:30 p.m.,
Closing forum and keynote address. The future as tradition.
Sir Norman Bullock Carver, guest speaker. 10 p.m.,
Departure via SS Skagway Princess.
Luncheon over, the critics repaired to the loyal Coyote Hall, where they were given official greetings by Councilman Stafford Byers, filling in for Mayor Wennergren, who was called upstate on family business shortly after it occurred to him that another editorial like the one in the Whaler Schooner would not appreciably enhance his prospects for the State Assembly. In his Honor's absence, Councilman Byers spoke of those eternal truths in the relations of man and soil, which he held appropriate for any audience, at any time, in any place.
There are those of you who will choose to remain and become one with this land. To those, I would say to those, the land is good and will endure. and will bring great reward to those who live in harmony with its laws. And so I say, how's that? Critics, I declare. I thank you.
For the most part, the conference sessions were well attended, the notable exception being Lars Trollenstern's presentation, The Quaver in Krennic, which Homer Sibelius, heading up the Times and Places Committee, had scheduled for the pre-breakfast slot on Sunday. However, Trollenstern's paper was delivered to an appreciative audience consisting of Jessie Doolittle, the loyal Coyote Brotherhood's cleaning lady, and Keddy McQuaig, who was picking his way home from the Oilers' roost and who permitted himself a rather tiresome amount of heckling. Primary interest, of course, was centered on the evening forums. And in the first of these, Homer Sibelius, chairing the discussion, The Changing World of the Reviewer, suggested that in the absence of anything else worth reviewing in Port Chilkoot, he would not be adverse to offering a brief piano recital. This he proceeded to do, and to the intense annoyance of Lars Trollenstern, rendered in one sitting the complete keyboard works of Thalberg and Moskowski. The interpretations partook of that same forceful athleticism for which his journalistic style is justly noted, and but for the 3 occasions when Albert Tanner, the handyman, was summoned from the wings to replace a bass string on the loyal Coyote's upright, he continued, neither pausing for applause nor revealing the slightest indications of fatigue. It was, stated Keddy McQuaig, who sensed his own imminent elevation to the presidency, a direct, straightforward, yet strangely human exposition of this neglected literature. Less cordial was the review of H.B. Hagel, who, having long since resigned political ambition, remarked that it was, after all, direct and straightforward music, and what do you expect? So it went throughout the convention, and all the members were much relieved when at last Sunday evening was at hand, and factional differences could be set aside in anticipation of the keynote address. This was to be delivered by Sir Norman Bullock Carver, critic emeritus of the Manchester Spiritus et Angelus, by appointment advisor in reviewing to Her Majesty Elizabeth II, and instructor in counterpoint, first species, to the Lady Sarah Armstrong Jones, or at least he will be when the Lady Sarah attains her 5th birthday. Sir Norman, it must be admitted, was very much a compromised choice as guest speaker. Lars Trollenstern was willing to settle for Knud Jeppesen, Henri Pousseur, or Hans Keller, but Homer Sibelius went out on a limb for Ruggero Ricci and stayed there. For both factions, however, the title of Sir Norman's address, The Future as Tradition, seemed promising, and all the delegates settled down that warm August evening to enjoy the venerable gentleman's remarks.
I should like to say, straight off, that there are in our midst anarchists whose scheme it is to jeopardize the framework of our musical society.
For Waldorf Major, this phrase alone justified the trip, and he gave a perfunctory sneeze in the direction of Lars Trollenstern.
I have in mind young Elgar, Holst, and others of their ilk.
It was the address that Sir Norman had composed in the spring of 1892 upon the occasion of his being made Don of King's College, Cambridge, and which he redelivered some 18 years later at the time of his election to the Halley Society.
It is up to those of us blessed with a reverence for the past to enshrine that lofty sentiment forever in our breasts.
Keddy McQuaig released an irreverent guffaw, but hurriedly converted it to a spell of asthma when he noticed that Waldorf Major, whose vote he would surely need next year, appeared displeased.
As I look into the youthful faces assembled here today, I am compelled to urge you to bear that torch brightly.
A sudden and imperious toot from the SS Skagway Princess brought Homer Sibelius hurriedly to the rostrum to deliver the vote of thanks, and summoned as well the Chilkoot Continuation School choir and silver band, who were determined to bid the critics bon voyage with a reprise of Master Clarkson's anthem. Sir Norman, whose hearing had been in decline since the heroic holding action in October 99, when serving at Mafeking under Baden-Powell, he directed for 36 harrowing hours the percussion ensemble of the Royal Winchester Fusiliers, was quite unaware of the convention's precipitous termination.
Into whichever distant
Sir Norman,
land
I know
your
that
work
I
may
can
call
really
you.
express on behalf of all
I,
present
your
here at
hopes
the
and
convention
dreams,
our most sincere gratitude for your stimulating and truly memorable address.
faith of the Academy.
May I remind all the members that they should definitely remember to pick up all their belongings, and I do mean all, and Harry Southam's before proceeding to the dock. Remember, I hereby declare the convention absolutely adjourned.
Farewell.
Once safely aboard, the critics quietly drifted apart. Keddy McQuaig, intent upon toasting his own incoming presidency, invited the navigator, Ole Olofsson, to join him for a quick one, an invitation which caused the Skagway Princess to circle 3 times around Haines Island before setting course for Yokohama. The course was straightened out when Lars Trollenstern, fascinated by the navigational possibilities of the hexachord, prepared a serialized compass system which he presented with his compliments to Captain Kurt Blitzleben. H.B. Hagel and Waldorf Major decided to bury ancient hatchets in the interest of expediting a palace revolution. As for Homer Sibelius, the conference had not been a happy one for him, and on coming aboard he withdrew to his stateroom, informed the steward that he would be taking all meals in, and after securely locking the door and covering the portal which gave on to B-deck, he produced from his luggage a carefully wrapped silver baton, which had been presented to him by George Zell on the occasion of his 100th consecutive bad review of Leonard Bernstein, and tuning his transistor to CBC Vancouver, which comes in loud and clear in the twilit midnight of the Arctic summer, and hearing for the first time in his life the Symphony No. 14 by the Canadian transcendentalist Zoltan Mostanyi, he raised the baton, and with firm masculine beats, vigorous, no-nonsense cut-offs, and withal maintaining an impeccable and confident posture, gave it a virile and thoroughly professional rendition. At Port Chilkoot, life resumed its familiar pace. Magdalena Murphy decided against a follow-up feature on the convention, and on the following Saturday carried in the packet and without comment a Reuters dispatch datelined Tutuila, Samoa, which noted that Sir Norman Bullock Carver, the distinguished British critic, had spoken to the island's Historical Society on the subject The Future as Tradition, and had given warning of alarming and revolutionary developments in the world of music.
Well, Mr. Gould, that was at least as vitriolic and outrageous an attack upon the members of the critical profession as anything you have charged to their account, certainly. Have you tried confronting any of those gentlemen directly?
Well, there's been no real confrontation, Ken, but I'm at least on speaking terms with 4 of the 6 who served as models for the Chilkoot Conference.
But you've not directly engaged them in dialogue about their role in musical society.
No, I must admit I haven't managed to dialogue with any of the Chilkoot cast directly, but I did speak earlier this week to the New York critic, Robert Offergeld. Bob, let me ask you the question which all musicians hope to ask someday of all critics. Is criticism necessary?
Well, yes, I think it is. I think it's necessary for a great many reasons. I don't think it necessarily ever changes the course of music history very much.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that criticism as such has ever helped a composer. I know it has helped performers at times.
Has it ever hindered a composer or a performer for that matter?
I doubt it.
Why?
I seriously doubt it.
Really?
Yes. We remember, for example, that moment when Beethoven was writing some of his earlier works, and his publisher in Leipzig, I think it was also the publisher of a journal in which critics unfriendly to Beethoven were allowed to express themselves. And he wrote a very strange letter to his publisher, and even then he didn't come out and say that he was offended. He said, if I remember correctly, you will, if you are not careful, turn off the talent of a great many young composers who are not strong enough to face up to this. Well, of course, I'm not so sure that that ever happens.
Well, have we any real evidence for the fact that it doesn't? I mean, presumably if those talents are turned off, we don't know about them, and how can we, judge the issue from that angle?
Well, we see in the case of many, many people, of course, who had tremendous careers, not only music, but in the other arts, that actually criticism had a galvanizing effect on them more than anything else. The more indignant they became, the more they mobilized their defenses.
Well, I can understand a certain kind of person who would decide to remove themselves altogether from the world, which included the world of critics, and in that particular galvanization, they found, some refuge for their talent, and they could continue to be creative and productive and whatever. But what of those who haven't quite got that strength and that freedom from inhibition, and who can't remove themselves so easily, and who feel terribly, terribly exposed to altogether too many eyes? Isn't that something that can greatly inhibit, even the vastest of talents?
Well, that's a very as-if question. In the first place, you say it might turn off talents we don't know about. We don't know whether it does or whether it doesn't. Creative people ordinarily are pretty much outside the usual frame of reference in a great many ways long before they set note to paper. I mean, usually as children, or sometimes if they start working as adults, they aren't all that foursquare. They usually have resources that other people don't have. They have to have if they're going very far. That we know. In this particular context, I have a sort of loose understanding with myself about the difference in function between, let's say, a blurb writer, a reviewer, and a critic. The reviewer is a man who, by definition, must not write a blurb. There is no law that says he must write good criticism either, of course. Since he's scared to death of being thought a mere blurb writer, the average reviewer almost never writes a really favorable review. He's of course, tied by the nature of his job to something that actually happens as a matter of real history, a real concert, a real recording. And this also irks him if he feels that he has a real pipeline to the zeitgeist. If the concert or recording don't give him the chance to spread the illumination he's so full of, he's apt to make short shrift of it.
Yeah, but why are artists singled out for this very special favor? I mean, artists and maybe sports figures and certainly politicians tend to earn this kind of dissection in the press or in other media. And this is not true, let's say, of the manufacturing world. It's not true of the business world. Mr. Heinz doesn't pay flax to tell Mr. Campbell that his soups are no damn good, I mean, maybe they do have advertising campaigns a la Hertz and Avis that cannily suggest one way or another.
The parallel there isn't really exact, Glenn.
Why?
Well, because there are critics of Mr. Heinz and the other people as well. They don't criticize each other, but neither do artists.
No, but there are Ralph Nader-like critics who sit there on behalf of the public as a whole and say this product is being foisted upon us and it isn't what it's advertised to be, But that's a rather different thing because they're not dealing in a subjective matter. They're doing something that can be chemically analyzed. Of course they are.
No, it's not true. The job of the real music critic is precisely like that. He has two main functions. The oldest one, the time-honored one, gives him the job of standing guard between the people who make the music and those who consume it. As a trained musician himself, and nobody who's not trained should hang out his shingles, the critic is thus equipped, he's in a position to thunder warnings when the consumer obstinately prefers tacky and unimportant pieces to well-made and important ones, which is very often the case.
Yeah, well, if you persuaded a child that he or she could do just about anything that he or she wanted to do, they might not really ever do it well, but they would do it to whichever fullest extent they were capable of, And I suspect that this is very true of most of us and of most people in whatever field of endeavor they happen to find themselves. If you tell people they can do something, they will unleash whatever creative energies they have available. If you tell them they probably can't and probably never will, then indeed they will be so totally inhibited from...
Well, it seems to me a little bit wide of this particular mark, Glenn. I'm all, as you know, for encouraging everybody to express himself in every way possible. And I couldn't be more sympathetic about that. But I'm quite serious about this critic and this function that he has.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he ever changes the course of music history. But several critics who occupy this function, Nietzsche, for example, Schumann at times, Berlioz, even Hanslick, and to a degree George Bernard Shaw, they all created a wider intellectual audience for music that was all to the good.
But surely he also has a human responsibility, which has perhaps very little to do with this wider context that you seek from. You know, a friend of mine, I don't know when it was, 4 or 5 years ago, I've told the story very often, argued about it very often. A friend of mine went to a Rudy Serkin concert, and he went backstage afterwards. He doesn't look a bit like Rudy Serkin. Looks a little bit like Kassad Sue, maybe, but not at all like Rudy Serkin. Anyway, a rather elderly lady came up to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Serkin, that was superb, one of the great evenings of my life." And I guess after a moment's quandary, he said, "Thank you very much, madam. That's very, very kind of you." He did not mention that he wasn't Rudy Serkin. He accepted the compliment. He realized that was all she had in mind. She wasn't passing on
Oh, I
any
think
human
you have
situation,
to.
Bob.
Oh,
I
I
don't
think you have
believe in
to.
it.
Sure
Why?
you do.
Why?
Well, for a great many reasons. I mean, motivation becomes terribly important and terribly moral or terribly immoral as it's beamed at the object in view. In this case, we're talking about the criticism of a performance or of a composition. I think the
Which may or may not have been
the
given or written
personal
by an old
feelings,
lady.
The
I mean, what's the
personal,
difference?
the personal feelings. Yes, but it's coming from left field.
But you're so
there. It's-
typically American. I mean, that's the kind of Medicare for the aged policy that all you Americans pursue, you know.
I do nothing of the kind. I'm extremely aged myself, and I have no I'm not asking for Medicare. Now, look, I resent that old lady. I want to get her the hell out of here. She doesn't belong in here. We're talking about critics. Now, good manners is something else again. There's no way to legislate good manners. There's no way to legislate human sympathies of any kind. But what you can legislate, up to a certain point, is the reputability, the authority, and the integrity of the people who comment on matters of art. This is a great...
But, Bob,
This is of great importance.
there is a larger human responsibility, and it is very, very like that old lady and the man who looked like Kassad Sue but who was held to look like Serkin. I don't see the distinction. I really don't. I don't see
Well,
on what
I
level
do.
you make it.
Because I don't want to talk about that old lady anymore. I want to talk about critics. It is precisely the music critic's job to make waves. And in this capacity, he's either a gadfly or he's nothing much. I feel very strongly about this, Glenn. In periods of artistic law and order, to use a phrase we're hearing every day now, it is the critic's categorical imperative to make revolution. In periods of anarchy and fragmentation, I think it's his categorical imperative to make a new order.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just feel that there is a different kind of world possible which doesn't have to do with these arbitrary assumptions about the critics and the criticized. I doubt that the world breaks down that simplistically somehow, and I just think that, you know, it's all very well to want to clean somebody else's house, and undoubtedly there are hard times, you know, when it's even in a consumer fashion necessary and useful, but I just really wonder whether, all things considered, it to put an old-fashioned phrase on it, does good.
Well, I'll tell you, from some of the remarks you've made and from what I feel to be the drift of your argument, I would like to point out that utopianism is not a weakness only of liberals. It also has some very strange reactionary manifestations. You may have read, I think it was Goethe, or Goethe quoting Novalis or somebody. He arrived at in this parable he wrote, in which he arrived in a country in which all was complete harmony, serenity. And he said, how is this country governed? And the reply was, it is governed by music. It's a lovely concept. It's a lovely concept, but it's hopelessly utopian.
What's the name of that country? I want to live there.
It's the utopianism, you see, it's the utopianism of a reactionary rather than of a revolutionary.
Why?
And I think a little bit of your... Because you keep talking about an ideal situation in which people don't have specific jobs in which they have to function. A critic is a man hired to do a job just like anybody else.
No, I'm talking about an ideal situation, if that's what it is, in which no one regards themselves as either subject to criticism or immune from their own criticism, which the checks and balances, to use
well,
another of your
that's as
American favorite
utopian as
phrases.
anything I've ever heard anybody say. Where you find people like this? This is an impossibility.
You have to breed
Glenn.
them. You have to breed them. In the same way that the nature of criticism, as directed toward the political world, let's say, has
Well, I hope
managed...
you mean breed them intellectually.
Either way, but I mean that the nature
I can't go along with that. The people who have their hands on the genetic codes in our chromosomes are the fortune tellers of all time. And they have no evidence to show that they're going to produce a better world than the one we're in.
Well, do you mean to tell me that there is no correlation between the kind of criticism that is incessantly directed at the world of politics and the fact that, generally speaking, we have a rather lousy breed of human being who turns out to be a politician?
Aha.
Because that thick-skinnedness which can take that kind of criticism has to be bred over generations of experience of it.
Oh,
and
yes.
finally, you get a sort of person who is just unworkable in any other field but the political spectrum and
The
has
United
no
States-
broad sensitivity.
The United States Congress, as I was remarking to a group last night when we were in a political discussion, is immune to criticism.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't respond to criticism at all.
Precisely, that is what I'm
It is
saying.
not immune to pressures from lobbies. Now, that means that the level of political criticism is very low, and they should heed some of my examples. Works of art, works of music are exactly like those paintings that Gertrude Stein used to plaster all over the walls of her apartment. She had them hung from the floor to the ceiling, and people said, "Don't they drive you crazy?" She said, "No." She said, "Because after a few days, some of them just sink into the wall." And this is true. If we could give enough exposure to music, it would sort itself out rather quickly.
And then we wouldn't need critics, do you mean?
Well, wait a minute. I didn't say that. I'm not trying to keep a job as a critic, but I'm saying that there are always things happen that give the critic a point. If you're trying to say to me that by some involuted process, a man who is a case of mistaken identity and who's charming and civilized about it has anything to do with the concert that the critic has to review, I don't see the connection. I really don't.
Well, then you must leave it to me to explain the connection further to Ken Haslam.
Ah, Mr. Gould, a most heated dialogue indeed, but clearly the result of some long pent-up resentment on your part. Do you feel the better for it?
Yes, I think I do.
I thought you might. But I was surprised, Glenn, that you didn't get Mr. Offergeld on the subject of Beethoven and his late sonatas, which, after all, introduced this program.
Well, I didn't have to, Ken. He brought up the subject by himself, actually, without reference, however, to my Opus 109 interpretation directly. But he did have a very interesting comment to make. He said that he felt it was particularly important to observe the way in which critical language evolves, language that's applied to criticism as it changes through the generations. And unfortunately, I had to delete that part of the interview.
What? You cut a critic?
Well, only to make room for your own summative judgment, sir.
Oh, well, there's some justification in it then.
Anyway, he made the point that the linguistic evolution is terribly important to criticism, but that in certain situations the applicable language just prematurely calcifies. He used the example of Beethoven, actually, and he said that, the epithets generally applied today to Beethoven's music were already being applied to it by the time he wrote the Fifth Symphony, say, about the year 1806 or 7. It was described even then, apparently, in terms relevant to personal freedom and abolition of tyranny.
In other words, the whole post-French revolutionary jargon was evoked.
Exactly. It was the language of Napoleonic Europe. And it isn't a language that's in any way applicable, as far as I'm concerned, to the late sonatas and the late string quartets. And I suspect that it's that very linguistic default which has, probably caused a good deal of misunderstanding about the sort of beast they are and the way or ways they can best be realized. Certainly one can't realize them in the interpretive fashions appropriate to the Fifth Symphony or the Appassionata Sonata or whatever. As a matter of fact, Mr. Offergeld took very much the same sort of stand in relation to Mozart.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he felt that Mozart had been very badly served by a critical language which consistently describes him in terms of 18th century manners and elegance, and I couldn't agree more, as you probably know.
Yes, well, in view of our various Mozart jousts through this series, I won't ask for an elaboration of that one. I would imagine, though, that since you've just produced a new volume of Mozart piano sonatas, which one of our local critics referred to the other day, and most glowingly, I might add, as deliberately devoid of precisely those qualities, Mr. Offergeld's remarks in that area at least were particularly welcome.
Indeed they were.
Ah, Mr. Gould, allied with a critic at last.
Theme and Variations. The final movement from Mozart's Piano Sonata Kirschel 284 has concluded this week's edition, Take 20, of The Art of Glenn Gould. Next week, in the final program in this series, some thoughts about music in an electronic age, including a rebroadcast of Mr. Gould's 1968 documentary, originally produced for the series Sunday Supplement, on the sociological and theological implications of Bach as represented by a synthesizer. This program was produced in Toronto by Richard Coulter, with technical operations by Lorne Tulk and Don Logan. This is Maggie Morris speaking.